couple years back, I was coming home from a gig in Cambridge, England, and I didn't have enough fuel to get home, so of course I pull into a petrol station. I'm pressing the pump but getting no response from the shop, and I can't see an assistant on the other side of the window. It's 2 a.m. at this point, so the shop isn't open. You have to pay through the hole in the window. Anyway, I'm standing there like a lemon and nothing's happening, so I approach the night window and bang on it. Still nothing. Nobody's there. Just then, I hear a shuffle behind me and a deranged, breathy giggle. As I spun around, there he is, the strangest, most peculiar looking motherfucker I've ever seen. A wide-eyed, scruffy hooded man on all fours in a crawl position, head cocked up glaring at me with a menacing, snarling, salvia lace grin. I backed away slowly, just assessing the situation. Is he just a nutter that escaped from the asylum? Or is he a sinister asshole trying to get a thrill out of scaring people? As I back away, he slowly moves sideways, whilst giggling and wheezing at the same time. Our glares are locked on each other, and I'm preparing to run up and boot him in the chops. Just then, the shop attendant appears from hiding under the counter and puts a sign against the window saying, "Police have been called." This is enough to get the lunatic's attention, and he slowly rises to a hunched standing position and just stares, still smiling, at the window and makeshift sign. This gives me enough time to run and jump into my motor. I get in and lock the doors, but stick around as I wouldn't forgive myself if the shop guy gets hurt or anything. Even though this nutjob is locked out, you never know. The freak didn't move a muscle for what seemed like 3 minutes or so, but then the sirens in the distance snapped him out of it. He lifts his head to shout and swear towards the sky, then runs off into the trees behind the petrol station. At this point, I've had enough and exit for home. The adrenaline lasted hours, but I managed to drive okay, and all was fine. He was just a man in a hoodie acting like a fucking loon, probably high on something, but it was extremely creepy. This happened about 3 years ago when I was 18. At the time, we lived in a kind of strange city with a decently high crime rate. It was more of an industrial town. The only things close by were U-Haul, gas stations, grocery stores, and a bunch of construction, manufacturing type businesses or abandoned buildings. My partner worked at the 7-Eleven just a half mile up the road or so. I drove him to work and picked him up since he worked the night shift, and I didn't feel comfortable letting him walk to and from. It was around midnight or so, one of his work nights. He asked me to come visit since they weren't extremely busy. This is something I do semi-frequently. The side of the building where I was parked was a blind spot as far as surveillance goes, but I parked over here to free up parking in front of the building since I anticipated staying a while. There weren't a ton of vehicles, only a few scattered around the parking lot, including a white, fairly new-looking pickup truck near where I parked. An older man, probably in his late 30s, early 40s, was standing near the truck, and I had to walk past him to get to the building. When I went by, he stopped me, standing partially in the walkway. At first, I wasn't super uncomfortable, just moderately annoyed since I didn't enjoy talking to strangers. He starts telling me how his truck wasn't working and he couldn't get it to start. I didn't really question it and dismissed him by saying that I knew nothing about cars, so there's nothing I could do to help him. He was pretty persistent after this, asking me to come look and telling me about how it just wouldn't work, how he needed my help and whatnot. By this point, I'm pretty weirded out since I said at least 2 or 3 times that I knew nothing about cars, so I didn't see how I would be helpful in any way. He also asked me what I was doing out so late, etc. I told him that my boyfriend worked there and I was coming to visit. He looked noticeably uncomfortable at that. I took my chance and quickly walked into the gas station and got my partner to come out. Without any hesitation, the guy jumped in his truck and immediately sped off, like suspiciously fast. All in all, it was just super weird, and I don't know what would have happened if I had gotten any closer to the vehicle, since it was clearly working just fine. Nothing ever came of it, and I didn't get his license plate number since I would have either had to go around to the back of the truck, which was dangerous and he would have noticed, or I would have had to get it as he was pulling off, but he reversed and just sped down the dark road, so there's no way I could see it. So to preface the story, I live in a small village where we all know each other. This takes place around 10 p.m. at a gas station that's in the corner of my village. I was on my way to a friend's house with my sister and her boyfriend. They were both 3 or 4 years older than me, so they were driving me to my friend's house. We stopped at a gas station and I walked in to get a drink while they stayed in the car. As I'm walking in, a middle-aged man yells from across the parking lot, "Hey, how are you?" Again, it's a small town, so I think he's being friendly, so I answer, "I'm good, how are you?" He says, "Fat and greasy, loving the life." I immediately get a strange vibe, but laugh it off. Right before I reach the door of the building, he goes, No, I'll get the door for you." I was in front of him, so naturally, I got the door for myself. He said, "What's a little girl like you doing opening doors for herself? There's a lot of germs." Then he smiles and winks at me. I laughed it off because I think he's being friendly and I'm just overreacting due to my horrible social skills. I go to get a drink and wait in line for the cash register. The computers were having some issues, so I was there for quite a while. It's finally my turn, so I walk up, set my drink on the counter. The cashier asks how I am, and I say good. The man walks beside me and leans on the counter and says, "This little girl called me fat and greasy in the parking lot." I was super weirded out by now. I nervously laugh and say, "No, I didn't." I get my drink and pay, and I start to walk out, and as I head towards the door, so does he. I stop walking and pretend I need something else, and he stops too. I start towards the door again, and there he goes, following me. I had a gut feeling that he had bad intentions, so I called my sister's boyfriend to come in and walk me out to the car. While many might say that this guy was just being friendly, I was completely unable to shake the fight or flight feeling that I had, especially as a young teenager in a gas station at night, wearing a crop top. If anyone possibly has an explanation of why he was following me like that or anything, please let me know. It still scares me to this day. Context: I was 26 and I'm a lady. I needed gas and it was around 11 p.m. on a Saturday. I pulled into a busy gas station to fill up my tank, except it was completely bare, not a car in sight. I also live in Alaska and it was very cold this night, maybe -10. Tired from work, just wanting to get home. Usually I start my pump and sit in the car due to the freezing cold, but this time I got a weird feeling that I needed to stand next to the pump, so I did. I had just started pumping my gas when a little golden sedan pulled up right next to me. A guy got out, and I was feeling hypervigilant for some reason. He started cleaning his completely clean windows, and as he put back the squeegee, he started towards me. I felt like I wanted to run, but stayed calm and continued pumping. He asked me if I'd help him put windshield wiper fluid in his car because he ran out, and he doesn't know how to lift the hood. I laughed it off and told him I didn't know either, which was a lie. He kept getting closer and closer to me while trying to lure me to his car by saying something was under the seat and he can't reach it because he's too big. Now I'm 5'2" and petite. This man was large and scruffy. Think Alaskan wilderness dude. At this point I'm freaking out and I hit the call button on the pump. He took a step back and started back to his car. I thought I was being smart. My gas is almost done and noticed that the insides of the doors had no handles except the driver's door. That freaked me out. I was putting the pump back and was opening my door and he was right behind me. He slammed my door shut and yelled, "You're coming with me." Obviously I refused and I was petrified. He grabbed my arm and slammed it against the car. I elbowed him as hard as I could as I started to scream on the top of my lungs. Thank God for the gas station attendant and his big ass gun that night, because if not for him, I don't know what would have happened. The attendant pulled a video and made a police report. I called immediately after the guy took off. I never heard anything else about it. I just hope he didn't get some other girl alone. So to the guy with no door handles, let's not meet. About 5 or 6 years ago, I was working at a gas station and I ran into a girl I recognized from high school. She was with her boyfriend, who was a regular in the store. I distinctly remember him because he wore these really cool looking horn-rimmed glasses. We get to talking and I asked him if he wanted to get together and smoke a bit. He agreed and said that he would wait for me after he dropped his girlfriend off. So end of shift comes, around 11 p.m., and he's outside waiting for me. He tells me a really cool smoke spot. I follow him in my car to said smoke spot, and we end up at a gravel lot surrounded by various RVs and trailers. I didn't think much of it because it seemed pretty safe and out of the way from police, etc. We smoke a bit, and afterwards he invites me to his place, and since I was pretty baked, I said, fuck it, why not? Dude leads me down a really dark neighborhood and takes me to a house that he enters from the basement that leads into a nice room, except for the fact that there was nothing but a bed and a TV. Did I mention that there were plastic sheets around the TV and near the bed? The hairs on the back of my neck stood up like I was in danger, and when he asked me if I wanted to sit on the bed, I politely declined and said that it was time for me to go home. He then asked me if I wanted to smoke another blunt before heading out, and me being the young fiend I was, I said alright, but I also insisted that it would be outside. He invited me to his car. Now I was already on edge, maybe from the weed, and when the guy turns the radio on, he turns on some music from the early 1900s, the type of shit you hear in serial killer movies, and starts going on and on about how it's his favorite music. I asked him if he was going to roll it up or not, because I was really only there to smoke before I left, and he hadn't started. So he pulls out the wrap and pulls out a knife. The second I saw the handle, I bolted. I'm talking fastest I've ever ran back to my car. I locked both doors and turned the ignition on before he could even get out of the car. I screeched my wheels peeling out of that neighborhood. Never spoke to him again. I swear I met a serial killer that night, and I just barely managed to get away. What do you guys think? Was I just tripping balls? This took place back in 2014. I was 17 years old and lived in a very small town in Massachusetts. Every night I would take a walk after sundown. I enjoyed it. It was peaceful. Now I understand that this whole setup is inherently sketchy, and walking around town in the dead of night is just asking for trouble. I was a very antisocial person, so I did it every night. I lived on a street about 4 miles long in total, and there would be a few houses every half mile or so, but for the most part, things were pretty secluded, other than a decently sized cemetery that I would sometimes hang out at. The street had about 5 streetlights, and one of them was constantly bugging out and never got fixed. In order to get to the center of town, I had to walk for a few miles, essentially in pitch black darkness. Past the cemetery at the end of the street was a local donut shop, and then the center. I would listen to music in the dark, with a flashlight being the only decent light for miles until I got into town. I would wear this long black pea coat. At one point, I shaved my head completely bald, so that people would think that I was creepy and wouldn't bother me if they were driving down the road that particular hour. The local police were familiar with me, my family, and our kind of messed up background. In 2013, my brother saved me from my dad after he tried to beat me up. He was beaten unconscious, and the police were called. After that, he left, and I haven't seen him since. That's not related to the story in any way. I think the cops realized that I was a troubled kid, but not out doing anything malicious, and they kind of let me just do my thing. I would often go into these weird fantasies where I'm some kind of vampire hunter who had to protect the town from these monsters that came out in the dark. Pretended that I was some parody comic book hero called the Night Lurker, who used a weaponized flashlight to fight off evil. It was cringy and stupid, but it was mostly a joke, and I had an extremely overactive imagination. I try not to tell most people about that. What does this have to do with the encounter? Absolutely nothing. Anyways, it was Halloween night. I was on one of my evening patrols, and I just got into the center of town. At the town center, there's a 24-hour gas station called Cumberland Farms. As I was walking up to the store, there was this extremely tall, slightly pot-bellied guy who was dressed like a clown, but his makeup made him look a bit more like Beetlejuice. He was staring at me with his eyes wide open and a toothy grin. I pretty much figured that since it was Halloween, it was just some guy trying to fuck with me, for fun. So I said, "Happy Halloween, man," and kind of blew right past him into the store. I bought myself a soda and some candy, and when I walked out the door, he wasn't there anymore. I continued my walk, put my headphones back on, and forgot about the guy. The whole town center is connected on Route 9 Main Street, and when I wanted to get around town, that was the road I walked on. So as I continued on, I let go of every single bit of common sense I had at the time, blasted my music to the point where I couldn't hear anything else, and just started running on autopilot because I've done it so many times. After walking about a mile from the gas station, there were no cars on the road, and I started to feel a bit uneasy. I looked back, and what do you know, the giant clown Beetlejuice looking guy is about 5 feet behind me, the same expression on his face from before, eyes wide, toothy grin. I also need to paint you a picture of how tall this guy is. He must have been like 6'7" and was towering over me. I'm 5'8". I kind of stopped in my tracks, took my headphones off, and looked at him. He just passes right by me, says, "Happy Halloween," in some weird-ass goofy clown voice, and continues walking down the street in front of me. That's the last interaction I have with him, but I kept my eyes out for him as I continued walking. Last I saw, he went into the subway parking lot and was peeking into the windows of the people's cars. I get that this guy was clearly just trying to creep people out because it's Halloween night and it's fun, but dude waited for me to leave the store, out of sight, then proceeded to follow me down the street when I wasn't paying attention, just to say Happy Halloween and then dip. And I still had the entire length of the street my house was on to walk in the pitch black. Needless to say, I turned the music volume down and consistently looked behind me the whole way home. Very creepy. I started working a part-time job at our local gas station convenience store over the summer of 2016 to earn some extra money while I attended college. When I was hired, I was informed that female employees were never scheduled to work the overnight shifts for obvious safety reasons, which I was relieved to hear. I wasn't so much worried about my safety, but I was concerned about not getting enough sleep before classes. It wasn't long before I found myself dreading the days I had to work though, as the job turned out to be much different than I had anticipated. We were always short-staffed, which forced us to constantly multitask between running cash registers, preparing food, keeping our eyes on the pumps, cleaning, stocking, etc. To make matters worse, the two women who managed the place were awful in every way, and I frequently found myself biting my tongue and talking myself out of quitting. I was especially on edge when they cut our 15-minute breaks down to 10 minutes, as I never seemed to have enough time to use the restroom and smoke a cigarette fast enough. But it wasn't until several annoying encounters with a regular, I'll call James, that I finally started to break. James was younger than me, maybe late teens or early 20s, and he thought he owned the place. Perhaps being the grandson of one of the managers gave him the sense of entitlement to fuck with people there. The first time I met James, he approached the counter to purchase some chewing tobacco. As I rang him up, I asked to see his ID, and he told me who he was related to. I politely asked him again to see his ID because I was new. Another employee overheard our conversation and assured me that he was old enough, so I went ahead to ring him up. Staring at me intently the whole time, he looked down at my name tag and said, "Mindy, that's a pretty name." I thanked him for the compliment and gave him his dip, but he continued talking to me and asked me several personal questions. He wanted to know where I lived, what my last name was, whether or not I had a boyfriend, etc. Meanwhile, a long line had formed behind him, and not trying to be rude, I said something like, "Sorry, there's a line behind you," and I casually motioned for the next customer to move up. But James didn't leave. He simply stepped to the side and continued talking to me and watching me as I rang up each customer. It was immediately uncomfortable and unsettling for me, but I did my best to pretend like I wasn't bothered, even when his persistence escalated and another coworker told him to leave me alone. James soon began to make more appearances after that, the second time being with his girlfriend and another male friend by his side. Yes, he had a girlfriend, and I was very confused when he started flirting with me again, this time right in front of her. But oddly enough, she didn't say a word, so I brushed it off and played along, assuming that he was just a goof that my coworker said he was. But when he sat in the booth with his sidekicks at the back of the store, I could still feel his eyes burning a hole right through me. Over time, I grew more suspicious of James as I would witness him do and say countless things to hurt others. I knew that he was annoying, and I had learned to brush him off, all in good fun type of humor, like everyone else did. but when I caught him making fun of another coworker to her face, all I could feel was anger towards him. I removed her from the situation by taking her place at the register, as I could tell that she was very hurt and embarrassed by his comments, and by doing so, it was apparent to James that I did not approve. He would continue to cruelly harass this poor girl, and even some of the customers who had came in, but trying to make him stop was like scolding a little child. I didn't lash out at him though, I just began to ignore him. James then started playing these head games with me while I was working. He would take soda and candy, walk outside without paying for it, and then come back in the store and say I forgot to ring him up, loud enough for everyone to hear. One night, he filled his entire gas tank and took off without paying for it, before returning to say he forgot to pay. He knew that he would always get away with it because his granny was the manager. By this point, it wouldn't have surprised me if he was really stealing gas and food from the store. There's something very dark and strange lurking behind his goofball facade, and I avoided him like the plague, though it was nearly impossible to do at times. Then one day, while I was working alone with another coworker, we were very busy with tasks, as usual, when lo and behold, James walks in by himself. I mutter something under my breath, pain in the ass, and I walked straight back into the freezer to finish what I was working on earlier, and then he followed me into the freezer. I didn't know he was there until he walked right up behind me and asked why I didn't greet him anymore. Startled, I jumped up and quickly turned around, grabbing my chest and asking him what the hell he was doing back there. He laughed as I told him I was busy and reminded him that only employees could go back in this area. He ignored everything I said and instead proceeded to ask me personal questions, just like the first day I met him. "You never told me where you live. I'm curious about you. I just want to know. Tell me where you live." He was moving closer and closer towards me, literally backing me up into the corner of the freezer. "Are you afraid of me, Mindy?" I tried to push past him, telling him to move, but he kept stepping in front of me, blocking my way out. "Not until you answer me." I started calling out for my coworker, who showed up and gave him hell for being in the freezer. I was finally able to push past James, and I made my way to the front counter, where I looked at the clock and saw that it was time for me to go home. I gathered my things and punched out as quickly as I could, but James followed me out to the parking lot. I swiftly got into my car, but James managed to grab the top of my door before I was able to shut it. "Come on, let me see your ID," he persisted. I repeatedly told him no before I found myself practically begging him to let go of my car door so I could get home. Then he grinned at me and said, "Don't make me follow you, Mindy." Chills ran down my spine, knowing how bold of a person he was, and considering the fact that he literally just cornered me in the freezer only minutes ago. I highly expected him to follow through. Threatened by visions of what my drive home might look like, I became angry. I looked at him dead on before shouting, "Let go of my fucking door and stay the fuck away from me." I then grabbed my door handle and ripped the door shut as hard as I could. He tried yanking at the door handle from the outside to open it, but luckily I locked my doors in time. He then continued knocking on my window, asking to see my ID. I started my car and started backing away from him. I turned the wheels and hightailed it out of there, while he just stood there and watched me speed off. I was never so glad to finally get away from him, but I was paranoid the whole time, thinking that he could possibly catch up to me on the road, even though I never saw his vehicle behind me. I would end up quitting the job after this, and I didn't care that the hiring manager was pissed off about it. I had enough of everything, and dealing with James was the last straw. I didn't bother explaining anything to my manager because it was apparent to me that James was probably never held accountable for anything he had ever done wrong in his life, and he likely never would be. I never saw him again after that, and I hope I never do either. James was a jerk, a clown, a joker, but he was also borderline psychotic. So this happened about 6 years ago in a very rural town at a gas station. By very rural, I mean drive over an hour before you even see signs of civilization. I was 16 and needed a job, so I applied and was immediately hired at this gas station. I was supposed to work the night shifts with another coworker, Jules, until I got the hang of everything. The first 3 nights were quiet, 2 customers max each night, and we spent most of our time talking about college. On the fourth night, around 11, we get our first customer, John. Now, everyone in town knew John, for he had some brain damage and was effectively 6. He was pretty big. We both knew John like Jules and thought he was great. He was sweet and funny. On this night, he had brought in $10 and wanted Snickers and Gatorade, which we gave him. He sat at the table that was out and started snacking while telling us about his new kitten. 30 to 40 minutes later, we get our second visitor, who turned our whole lives upside down. He was a man in his 30s or 40s. He had black hair and a leather jacket. He looked like a greaser. He wanted beer, which was locked up in another room and required someone to get it. Since I was new, Jules went to get it for him. The man said hi to John and me and started trying to strike up a conversation about school. Pretty soon, he started to steer the convo towards more inappropriate things, which, since I was a 16-year-old female, I found it weird. He wanted to know if I had a boyfriend, was a virgin, what kind of sex I liked. I silently prayed Jules would hurry up and return, and after dodging his questions for 10 minutes, she did. She gave him his drink and he paid, but he didn't leave. He started talking to her about the same things that he had with me. She was 18, still young, but also older than me. Thus, she was more bold, I guess. She shut him down and asked him to please leave. But now he told us he needed gas, so she unlocked one of the pumps, and he went outside to get his gas. 5 minutes later he returns. It's apparently not working. He asked if one of us could come out and help him. Jules volunteered, but before she left she handed me the keys. I wasn't allowed them since I was new. She also handed me a piece of folded up paper. On the paper it read, "Lock the doors and keep the lights on." I don't know if this is true everywhere, but where we were, if the gas station lights were on, including the signs and decorations, not just the normal ones, something was up. It was a sign to call the police in my area. She leaves with him and I lock the door, but I stay by the window so I can see them. John joins me and starts asking questions. What's happening? Where's Jules? Who is that guy? I explained the best I could that I didn't know, and that if something happened, we needed to run very fast to get help. It had been about 20 minutes and I couldn't see either of them because they were on the other side of the truck facing away from the window. The worst situations were popping into my head and I started to freak out, but suddenly Jules appeared and I unlocked the door to let her in. The guy's truck peels out and I lock the doors again. She tells me that the guy had grabbed her ass and told her that she could come home with him. Of course, she told him to fuck off or she would call the cops. We spent about 15 minutes calming down and eventually we all leave together. I quit the next morning and got a job in town, but Jules stayed. About a month later, it was on the news that she had been sexually assaulted by a guy who came in late at night. They never caught him, and whenever I go back home, I see her and we talk about that night. It was the same guy, she's sure of it. She's doing good and has a husband and a daughter. John moved to Cali with his mom and cat. I'll never forget that night though, and now whenever I go to a gas station, I check the lights.
It was probably mid-afternoon in the summer when this happened. A few friends of mine had come over for drinks and to smoke, when one of them says something about walking down to the store to grab some snacks and smokes. I volunteered to walk with them because I didn't want to go alone, even though the gas station was literally 2 blocks down at the other end of the street that I lived on. And so we set off. Really heavily distracted in our conversation, and my friend had music playing out loud on their phone. We were dancing, jumping around, and just being generally playful on our walk. We didn't notice when, 1 block down into our journey, 2 kids, maybe between the ages of 8 and 11, were blocking our path on the sidewalk while holding a big branch like a barricade. I remember we both just stopped dead in our tracks and stared down these 2 little girls for maybe 30 seconds of silence before my friend says, "Okay," and proceeds to just start walking around them on the street. I follow behind and the girls drop the branch and practically pivot on their heels, to watch us silently as we walked away. We kept looking over our shoulders while laughing at how weird the situation was. We got to the store, made our purchase, and took the same easy route home. This time, as we walked past the same general area that we had seen the two small girls, several more kids came out running from between the houses on either side of the street. At least 4 or 5 of them, including the 2 girls from earlier. They ran into the street and stopped in front of us, just silently standing there. I remember saying, "Oh, come the fuck on. Leave us alone before we go knocking on the doors looking for your parents." Before I even got to finish my sentence, one little boy ran up to my friend, grabbed his arm, and bit down as hard as he could. My friend was absolutely stunned, petrified, and just looked at me in panic while this kid was gnawing on his arm. I threw my hands up at him and gestured as if to say, "Do something." He takes the palm of his other hand and shoves the kid away, pushing his forehead back. The kid fell backwards on his ass, and I think that was the cue for the rest of them to come charging, because we turned heel and started bolting the opposite direction. We were standing close enough to them at first that one kid was able to get up right beside me, and I could see him snapping his jaws at me like a rabid dog before I gained speed and distance. After we lost them, we stood there panting. All I could say was, "What the fuck?" My friend argued that, what was he supposed to do? Knock the kid out? Knock on doors while these kids were practically biting at our ankles? I'm not sure we could have handled it any better, and luckily the bite didn't break the skin. We never went knocking on doors, but my friend did stop into a doctor the next day. I remembered something that happened to my best friend and I a few years ago. I figured I might share it. While my best friend, at the time, and I were seniors in high school, at around 2016-ish, we went on a weekend trip to visit my grandmother a couple hours away from my town in Georgia, USA. The town we lived in was comparatively small for the state, but one of the biggest towns within a few hours. But we had to travel about 2.5 hours through tiny, somewhat redneck towns to get to my grandmother's place. We were on our way back home when we had to stop at a gas station literally in the middle of nowhere. I'm talking cornfields, cotton fields, streets with no signs or lights, not even stop signs, and definitely no cell service. The convenience store attached to the gas station had maybe a couple of snacks inside, but it looked deserted from the outside. We didn't bother to get anything other than gas. I paid with my card, mainly because I didn't want to leave my 5'1", 100-pound friend alone in the car while I went inside alone. Another car pulled up on the other side of the single gas pump while I started pumping gas. I already had a weird feeling and decided to stay alert and stand outside the car with my driver's side door open, just so my friend could see and hear everything going on. A thin, late 50s-ish older man got out of the car. He seemed to be paying at the pump and standing beside his car while he got gas, but after a few seconds, he walked around the pump and maneuvered himself around my car door to stand within a foot of me. He asked if he could pump my gas for me. Luckily, the gas nozzle was locked, so it was pumping without me having to hold it. I placed myself between the opening of the door and the man. I prepared to either shut the door with me inside it, or move and slam it behind me to protect my friend if necessary. I calmly told him it was fine, no thank you. He looked me up and down, and with the corner of his lip tilted up, he said, "Pretty girls like you shouldn't be out here all alone, and you definitely shouldn't have to do this by yourself. Let a man help you, baby." And he covered my hand with his own as he reached for the gas pump I was holding. I jerked my hand out from underneath his and slammed my car door shut. Orange flags started tinting red, and my usual overly polite demeanor turned serious as I remembered something I'd read that said it was better to be safe and seem mean rather than be polite and uncomfortable. So I responded and said, "Sir, get away from me. I can pump my own gas and I've already said no thank you. Leave us alone." He didn't move. only raised his chin and managed to make eye contact with me. All of the lip tilt gone, I stared him down and figured I'd gotten enough gas to last us enough time to get the hell out of wherever we were. So I maintained eye contact, pulled the nozzle out, and basically threw it back onto the pump before getting in my car and drove away before he had even moved. As we drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw that his car wasn't even being filled up with gas, telling me he was driving by and decided to help a damsel in distress out. My friend was shaking the whole way home, telling me she would have just let the man pump her gas, but I'm just glad some of the confidence I'd gained from a subreddit helped me stay attentive and respond confidently enough to get out of the situation. About 7 years ago, when I was 17, my parents went out of town for a weekend and left me at home. This was a pretty common occurrence. My parents trusted me. I would usually spend these weekends away staying with friends or family, as my parents' house is a bit creepy to be in alone, even during the day. We live in a small rural town where everybody knows each other, and generally it's pretty quiet and safe. Saturday, I was supposed to stay with a friend, but her parents decided at the last minute not to let me stay. It wasn't a big deal that I had to leave. I was somewhat prepared to go home because her parents got weird about company sometimes. I left her house around 9:30 or 9:45. While I was on my way home, I got a weird feeling that I can't really explain. I just knew I didn't want to go stay at my parents' alone. I called my brother and asked if I could stay with him. At the time, he was living with a woman who had a small child. He told me it would be quieter and easier for him just to come stay with me since his dog would bark if I tried to come into the house. He said he would be at our parents' house in 20 minutes. For a bit of side note, my brother's a relatively scary-looking guy. He's about 6'3", 200 pounds, pretty muscular and covered in tattoos. After hanging up, I decided to stop at a gas station and grab a snack before going home, just so that my brother would be there when I got back. I pulled into the gas station. There were only a few cars in the lot, which is typical because this is a small town in the rural south, where everything pretty much stops after 8 p.m. I parked and walked up to the door. There was a man standing outside the door, smoking. He opened the door for me without saying anything. This is normal southern hospitality, especially since I'm a female. I smiled and thanked him. Inside, there was another man standing by the door. I noticed him staring at me as soon as I came in. He gave me that gross up and down look and said something to the effect of, "Hey sexy, what are you doing alone?" Creepy as fuck. I just ignored him and walked towards the back of the store. He yelled after me and called me a bitch. I still ignored him. I figured he was drunk, high, or just an asshole. Most people around here talk a big game, but rarely back it up. I wasn't scared, just annoyed. I got my snacks and paid at the counter. When I walked back up to the door, both men were gone. I was happy not to have to deal with any more catcalling. I began walking across the lot towards my car, which was probably about 100 feet away from the door. As I was walking, I looked down at my phone to see if enough time had passed for my brother to be at my parents' house. When I looked up, the asshole who was staring at me was standing at the pump staring. I looked at him for a second and continued walking. "Hey, you know you're supposed to answer a man when he speaks to you," he said. I remember saying something snarky back to him and getting in my car. He looked pissed at my sarcasm. I locked my doors as soon as I was in my car, started it, and was thinking of nothing but getting home to eat my snacks and hang out with my brother. I put my car in gear and realized the man had disappeared. I looked around before pulling out of my spot, only to realize that both men were sitting in a car facing mine across the lot. They were both staring at me and talking, occasionally even pointing toward me. I just stared at them, defiant and pissed. I didn't want them to think they scared me at all. While we were sitting having our staring contest, the man who had opened the door for me smiled and gave me the finger across the throat gesture, as in, "You're dead." I rolled my eyes and pulled out of the gas station, annoyed. To my dismay, they pulled out behind me. I hadn't been scared up until this point, because as I said, most people here are a lot of talk with no follow-through. Instead of going home, I took a few back roads that connect back in a sort of circle to see if they were following me, which of course they were. When they realized I was testing them, they drove up really close to me and started laying on the horn. I couldn't see their headlights, they were so close. I called my brother and told him what was going on. He told me to come home and he would handle it. I started driving home. The two assholes were still on my ass blowing the horn. Even with my detours, I was only about 3 to 4 minutes from my parents' house. I slowed down to pull in the driveway and was immediately relieved. At the end of my driveway was my brother standing shirtless, his shoulders back, hands crossed in front of his stomach, clearly holding a pistol, his intimidating-looking pit bull sitting by his side. I drove around him into the yard. The two guys actually started to pull in behind me until they saw my brother. They then hightailed it out of there. I have no idea what they would have done if I had stopped somewhere alone or kept driving. I always think fondly of that image of him standing there like a badass, ready to protect me. I am just thankful he was there. For a bit of context, I'm a 16-year-old female. A while back, I decided to stop by a gas station on my way home from school to grab some snacks. While inside, I walked up and down the aisles looking for something that caught my eye, when I saw a guy who looked to be in his 50s looking at me over the shelves. Thinking nothing of it, I went back to searching for something to eat while the guy wandered around a bit. He then paid and left. Eventually I found what I was looking for and went up to the cash register to pay. As the lady scanned the stuff I set on the counter, we got to talking. "Did you see that old guy who was just in here?" she said. I think so," I replied. "Well, when he came up here, he looked at you and said stuff like, 'That girl's really cute. Oh, if only I were younger. The things I would do,' she told me." I was super embarrassed at this point and I said, "Oh, that's really weird." "Yeah, just thought I'd let you know. Be careful when you leave," she said to me. I hurried back to my car and felt like I was being watched now, so I ended up taking a 5-minute detour to my house. I was with my sister, cousin, and ex-girlfriend on the way home from an out-of-town trip. We stopped at a gas station that's actually a popular destination before going through a mountainous area. I went inside to use the restroom while my sister pumped the gas. I was doing my business and noticed my phone ringing a few times. I didn't want to touch my phone for sanitation reasons, so I washed my hands and walked out to see the girls parked in front of the gas station, waiting for me. I get in the car and ask why they were blowing up my phone. They told me that some creepy old prick was pumping gas next to our car, and he kept gawking at my sister. He kept telling her that he wanted to take her to his house, deep in the mountains where nobody could hear her scream. I turn around and look through the rear windshield. I see this old man leaned against his van, fidgeting and hitting a stick on the van, still staring and watching us. I wanted to curb stomp this smug bastard. I was fuming, and lucky for him I didn't have a gun, but I did have a hatchet knife combo that I used to travel with. I climbed out of the back seat and made sure he saw me take out the knife. I started walking towards him to confront him. I wanted to pummel him so bad. He got scared, jumped in the van and took off. We tried to follow him, but there were too many semi-trucks crossing in both directions, so we lost him. I wanted to call the cops, but it was too late. It sounds radical, but please travel safe, and if you can, keep some heat on you, whether it's a gun or a machete. This happened at a super public place and nobody noticed. I'm glad my sister wasn't alone, and there were some other people around. I wouldn't want to imagine what would have happened otherwise. I'm quarantined with my mom. We're both avoiding going out when possible because we're both compromised. So we just take short trips for any errands we need to complete in order to not go stir crazy. Today she needed to go get gas, and we also needed a few groceries, so we both went. We saw my cousin at the gas station, and after I went to one of the pumps, I said hello while my mom went to pay for her gas. After she paid, I started pumping the gas and we all stood there chatting for a moment. When my cousin returned to the car, a man came out of the gas station. He was balding, unkempt, the kind you see in high school photos from the 80s. He was wearing a sort of tropical shirt with a notepad and pen in the pocket, dirty khakis and a tan jacket. He stopped at my cousin's car and talked to her. She's kind of small, so I stood there watching until she got in her car safely and I heard it start. My mom and I were pumping the last bit of gas into the car. Both of us didn't need to do it, but we were both glad just to be outside for a moment. The guy walked up to us while she was finishing up and said, "Are you having fun?" We just kind of glanced at each other and my mom said, "Uh-huh," and swatted me to make me go to my side of the car. I didn't go. I didn't want to until she was in the car herself. The guy then turned to me and said, "Are you having fun with your granddaughter?" As if he was trying to make a joke, but his facial expression never changed. I just kind of gave him a blank stare and said, "That's my mom." I squeezed between him and the bumper and moved to my side of the car. He followed closely and said, "I just came here from Michigan. I've been here for 10 years. I got in the car and held onto my door. He stared at where I was holding the door, then at my face again. I was giving him the same blank stare and said, "That's nice." My dog stuck his nose out and began barking at this guy. He's a 15-pound Yorkie and usually sweet, but he sounded like an angry guard dog while he was barking at this man. "Is the dog having fun?" the guy asked. I held onto the door tighter and said, "I guess so. Have a nice day." I closed the door quickly, locked it, and my mom drove off. My cousin drove after us. She'd been watching the entire time, waiting for either us or the guy to leave. My mom and I both remarked that the guy was creepy, and we thought he might try to jump in the car. I'm so glad I went with her today. This isn't too climactic, but it did open my eyes to what people are capable of doing. So, one day about 2 years ago, I was at my house with my youngest sister and our friend. We were hungry and decided to go out and get some sushi. On the way to the restaurant, I noticed I was low on gas, so I stopped to get some. I pulled up to the pump and parked the car. I went into the gas station to pay, while my sister and our friend waited in the car. As I was walking across the parking lot into the store, I noticed a man staring at me with a creepy smirk on his face. We made eye contact and yelled across the parking lot, "Hey beautiful, why aren't you smiling?" I didn't respond or even acknowledge him. However, a young woman who witnessed this said to him, "Do not tell her to smile. She doesn't have to do anything for you." To this day, I think about that woman. I thanked her and continued to walk into the store. As I stood patiently in line, the same man walked in. He came right over to me in line and started to touch me. He was rubbing my arms and lower back, and I pulled away. I said loudly, "Get away from me. I don't know you. Do not touch me or I will defend myself." Other customers and the cashier were watching us. I caused a scene. He whispered into my ear and told me to shut up so people don't think he's a creep. Suddenly the man ran out of the store and to my car with my sister and friend still inside of it. I ran after him. He opened the car door and started to say something to them when I yanked him back so hard from his shirt collar and punched him in the face. He proceeded to call me a bitch and every other name in the book, but he left us alone. He got into his car and drove away. I am much more aware of my surroundings now.